This is The Blockchain Show. The Blockchain Show is a podcast that demystifies and promotes widespread adoption of cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology. You're listening to episode number 61 with Charles Manning from Kochava. Coinbase is the easiest place to buy and sell digital currencies. Sign up today as a friend of The Blockchain Show, and if you buy or sell $100 of Bitcoin or more, you'll earn $10 of free Bitcoin for yourself and $10 of Bitcoin to support this show. Join now using the link in this episode's show notes at theblockchainshow.com.
My name is Charles Manning. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Kochava, Kochava, which is a technology company that's been around for 6 years that provides measurement and attribution for advertisers as they promote and advertise various things online, like their apps to get downloaded or offers and opportunities. We measure all of those activities so that we can illustrate the effectiveness of the ad dollars spent. So our customer is typically the advertiser who uses us as their system of record, their ledger, if you will, that highlights where money's being spent across the various different activities of advertising. And then as it's successful, it shows things like lifetime value for audiences as well as the ROI of that spend. We've been around for 6 years. We're a profitable company. We're a bootstrapped company. We have been around 130 employees today. And we began to not just walk in and dive into the rabbit hole, but kind of fall head first into the rabbit hole about two and a half years ago in the blockchain space. In particular, as Ethereum was coming out of beta, I took great interest in what that platform represented because it seemed an awful lot like, to me, we could build an Ethereum from the ground up, but for digital advertising, and account for the things that are specific to digital advertising in the same way that Ethereum did for altcoins and as an alternative to money transfer. And so that's our story. And we've created a project called XCHNG that is really the first at-scale digital advertising blockchain. We believe that will have the capacity to have the ability to affect change in the industry. Just one last point as I give the introduction of Kochava. We presently today, across our customers, we have customers like NBC, CBS, Disney, ABC, Netflix. We have gaming companies like Machine Zone, GSN, Big Fish Games. We have what's called QSR companies, quick serve restaurants, really fast food. So McDonald's, Chick-fil-A. These are all companies that use our platform today as they promote their apps and their web properties. We are the measurement system for them. And we presently measure about $6 billion in ad spend across our customer base today on an annual basis. And so ushering in this next generation blockchain platform, we believe is a unique positioning for us because of that nexus that we represent between buyers and sellers and media.
That sounds pretty much like the Minority Report. It really does. And I'm intrigued about how you do this. So can I ask how you do it before we get into the actual blockchain side of it?
I think that is as interesting as the blockchain stuff. But I think you're right. I think it is the method behind the framework and the ingredient set is what makes our leadership so unique. So we have a real-time system that is looking at millions of signals a second. And those signals represent what's called impression signals. So every time an ad is shown to any kind of device out there, and then when people actually click on that ad after it's been shown, that's a separate category of a signal. So it's a click tracker. We're tracking the click. And we tie the impressions to the clicks. And then if the user then goes to the app store and downloads an app that's related to that qualitative behaviors of the audiences, so when they level up in a game or they go through a tutorial completion process or let's say they connect their iWatch. See you're looking at your band of your watch. They connect their watch. I know it's not an iWatch band, but an audience that has an iWatch is a very different audience than an audience that doesn't have an iWatch. And it's interesting to know that about that audience, because you have ways to target and segment them differently and build your product differently in that context. So we look at all these signals and we tie it all together, and then we give real-time assessment and analysis in our dashboard of all these different audiences. So you can say, show me the audiences who were at one time a whale, so they spent a lot of money, but then they went dormant. And is there anything similar about those audiences that went dormant? Well, and I'm using kind of a simple example, but all of them went dormant after we updated to this version of the app. Well, maybe there was a bug and people got frustrated or whatever. And that gives that customer, that advertiser, the opportunity to say, hey, I want to spend some dollars now, but I only want to spend it to this cohort of user. And I want to have the ad specifically say, hey, we fixed this one bug. Come on back. We want to give you this new in-game item as an incentive to see if we've solved our problems, or whatever the example is.
Right. Okay. So it's almost like Freakonomics. You can basically link different statistics around your user base.
That's it.
Right. Okay. It's very similar to the statistics I read over Christmas from Cards Against Humanity, who got all of these statistics about their user base and then just blended them together. Yeah.
I think you nailed it. And what's so fascinating about it is, we have a lot of customers in the broadcast space, and without sharing what customer is doing what in terms of measurement, our customers who are advertisers, the reason they measure is they want to do a better job serving their customer. So it's not some weird kind of freakish thing where you're just getting measured to be measured. Every one of our customers, their data is their data. We don't share and anonymize all this data and have this big pool of audience data. The data we serve or we measure for one customer is explicit to that one customer. It's not shared with other customers. But the reason I bring that up is to say we have broadcast customers who not only measure, they're using the app, but they're measuring what content they're viewing and how long they're viewing that content. So they're big binge watchers of this particular series of show. And that becomes a really interesting opportunity to cohort that audience and say, hey, I want to target this one audience specifically to this other show that trends really well with this show that they really binge watch a lot of. So the bottom line is, if you're going to spend as much money as people spend in advertising, you're far more competitively positioned if you know where and how you're spending it and whether it's working. And we provide that answer.
Absolutely. And that sounds perfect. You know that I'm an over 40 male who's currently watching Jean-Claude Van Johnson series, etc. I know. It's not a bad series, by the way, but it's a long joke stretched out. Anyway, so where does blockchain actually fit into this?
You bet. So it is easily argued, both with analysis of third-party reports as well as our own observation of the space and how we've been serving our customers, that there is easily 50%, 50, of ad spend that is spent on inefficient infrastructure, overlap, fraud, and mediation elements that make effectively 50 cents of every dollar wasted. And what's interesting is that the basis behind all the different components and parts is that if there was intrinsic trust in the advertising ecosystem, you wouldn't need as much duplicative infrastructure to represent the various different perspectives of reporting that's required today. I mean, the fact that Kochava exists is a byproduct of advertisers who are buying media, relying on hundreds of different publishers who use hundreds of different technology products for ad serving and for ad delivery, and that advertiser wants a single source of truth. And so being a a CEO of a measurement company and observing what was going on with Ethereum 2.5 years ago, there was this acknowledgement that we could create a ground-up, brand new blockchain infrastructure with its own peer-to-peer infrastructure, its own consensus system, whereby the smart contract was not a mechanism to transfer altcoins from one user to another, but rather the smart contract could be the definition of an ad buy between an advertiser and a publisher. And if you could reduce the center point of a blockchain infrastructure around what in this industry you call an IO, an insertion order, which is the name used for a contract to buy media. If that IO was in a smart contract form and it was all on top of a blockchain that was custom fit to this ecosystem, you'd have and you made it open source, and you use the independent position of Kochava being this connector of all of these different actors and these publishers to propagate it and get it deployed at scale, you would have the Ethereum for digital advertising that's custom fit for the transaction volumes required in advertising. No one would build a system on Ethereum that has to serve the advertising ecosystem because it just wouldn't support the volumes. And B, the ecosystem players and the way in which the industry works, if you cater to both of those things, you would have a system of record that unified all of these actors as opposed to splintered and segmented all of these actors one from another.
That makes a lot of sense. How can we get involved with this? What can we do as lay people to get involved with your blockchain offerings, so to speak?
Sure. So just to kind of highlight, what we've built is the fundamentals of a next generation blockchain architecture that can handle the kind of volumes that we're dealing with in the advertising space, and a framework for these smart contracts to be around the IO. And in the meantime, we're building a program. We've built a program that we've announced called On Exchange. What I observed and what our team observed in the financial services space is as blockchain became more readily known and familiarized within the banking and financial services space, every bank and every entity in financial services wanted to build their own splintered fork of some blockchain. And the problem is that if you're just building a bunch of private blockchains, that's fine. If you need a public chain that's actually looking at the workflow of a contract between buyers and sellers and media, and there are various different parties involved in that ecosystem play, it needs to be unified. Otherwise, you have the same splintering problem that you have today. And so we spent a good part of the last 2 years building a first rendition or a first implementation of our blockchain infrastructure as a test case. And we're spending the beginning, so first quarter and second quarter of 2018, deploying that infrastructure to anyone who participates in our On Exchange program. And already we have a number of partners who have already signed up to our On Exchange program. We are principally targeting as our first partners the supply side or the publishers in the advertising ecosystems, because if buyers want to buy media but there's no inventory available on that system, then there's nothing to buy. And so we're focusing on the supply and the technology partners first, and we have leading companies in the advertising space, the independent advertising space, like AppOdeal, AppLift, Chartboost, Digital Turbine, Keep, PubNative, UAppy. We've got technology companies like Priori, which is like a benchmarking system for apps and relative engagement. Payability, which is a payment factoring company, and a variety of others, including obviously Kochava, who we've been retrofitting the Kochava platform to write and read from Exchange as it rolls out. So we'll be one of the participating partners, obviously, as the inventor of the system. But I think it's important to note that while we're deploying this across a number of partners in Q1 and Q2, it's really open to anyone, and we want to give this the full 3/4 of next year doing interoperability testing and tools development, and then rolling it out in production in Q4 of next year, really end of Q4. But the intent here is that with as much ad buying that happens across the duopoly, and that is Google and Facebook, the reason why there's so much growth in Google and Facebook is because both of those companies have done a terrific job making it easy to spend money, to buy media, to targeted audiences. And if you don't buy on Facebook and Google, you have this almost PhD that you have to earn knowing how you fit all the independent pieces and parts together. And what Exchange represents, what this blockchain represents, is a way to glue all those pieces together so that in addition to Google and Facebook, there's a third option, and that is Exchange, the blockchain-enabled framework for digital ad buys. And it makes it as simple as Google and Facebook. It makes it on an open system. It makes it a blockchain-backed framework, so it's immutable. And it makes it easy to spend money. And there is no intermediary like Kochava standing in the middle of it, or like a Facebook or a Google. No one is individually approving whether or not ads can be bought and sold. It's all protocol based.
Right. That sounds good. And the audience knows what question is coming next if they've been listening to the past episodes. Who's your biggest competitor in this space?
In our deployment across blockchain?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
You are doing this using blockchain. Who else is doing this?
Yeah,
it's the interesting thing.
It is really interesting. So there have been probably 6 or so companies or projects that have linked the phrase blockchain with advertising. And of those 6, I think 6 are doing something different than what we're doing. Now, that does not mean anything other than what it is. This is a brand, as you've seen on every project, there are varying levels of vision, varying levels of execution, varying levels of team across various different projects. And whether they're trying to attack the same problem or not is kind of up for grabs. So in the beginning, if I were to use such a phrase, in the beginning, and the beginning in this case is last spring, there is a company called Brave, who came up with the basic attention token and did an ICO, did a $30 million raise, really one of the early folks. And Brendan, who's the CEO there, is a great guy. And I think what they're doing is, what they're trying to articulate, if I were to speak for them, is that with their Brave browser, they want to tokenize end users' engagement with ads and to tokenize that process. And while that has something to do with advertising and blockchain, it's very different from what we're doing, which is centering around the contract of buying and selling media between the supply chain of digital ads and the demand chain of digital ads. You talk about digital advertising and blockchain, and you immediately go to Brave as kind of the first example. There's a few other projects like MetaX, who has, and I'm probably doing a poor job at this in terms of oversimplification, but MetaX did an ICO. I think they did between 7 and 10 million, and they really were trying to focus specifically on fraud. And for those of the folks in the audience that are familiar with a standard called ads.txt, this is a standard that the IAB has gotten behind. And the principle is that you have this white list of publishers that you want to buy from, and you enumerate those publishers in this thing called an ads.txt file, comparable to like a robots.txt file if you want to tell search engines to go scan your content. And the premise here is that it gives publishers control and advertisers control on how they meet. And what MetaX has done is effectively blockchain-enabled an ads.txt-like framework. Again, it's very, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but it's a very niche thing specific to a kind of a fraud whitelisting dynamic. And obviously their white paper is available for what they were going after, so people can read more. Again, what we're doing is really transforming the demand and supply chain of contracts of buying and selling media as a whole, and fraud by virtue of that actually gets addressed and mitigated into a large sense because of the architecture that we've built. We don't think a side project just on fraud is one that's going to get adopted at scale. So there's a few examples like that, and we are in the process of unlike any of these other projects, we are a company that is profitable, bootstrapped, 130 people, has some real operational history in terms of execution, and can leverage that position to be able to bring this technology to all of our customers, where $6 billion in ad spend is already being applied, and bring it to our community of publishers, where we've 3,500 ad networks and publisher media sources that are already integrated with our tech. And so because we're in that nexus, I think our capacity to execute is fundamentally different, and our vision is holistic in that it's looking at the life cycle of the insertion order. We have not seen any blockchain projects that look at that perspective, and it's an aggressive vision. There's no question. It's borderline crazy, but I honestly think there's no way to accomplish what we want to accomplish unless you reimagine how advertising can be executed.
Charles, have you guys ever looked into the podcasting advertising space?
We haven't, and it's interesting you bring that up, because I was recently asked that same question, and I mean like very recently, like a month and a half ago. There is apparently a hot mess that exists there, and it seems like it's an opportunity that absolutely should be executed on.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we're interested in as well. So
I would love to sharpen the pencil together and learn more about, these things are all patterns, and if to the extent that we can see how we can apply what we're doing already around signal aggregation and apply it in the context of podcasting, we'd love to look at that together.
That sounds like a great idea, and if we can help each other, that sounds very good. So really, two questions. You've chosen to use the blockchain. What sort of questions did you have around security of the blockchain? And the second part of that question is, what challenges did you have when you said to people around you, right, we're going to use the blockchain?
Right.
People must have gone, isn't that for the dark web and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you bring that up. So I think if we were to have started talking about what we're doing with Exchange, and this is really a funny thing. When I talk to blockchain audiences and you say the word exchange, which is the name of our project, XCHNG, they immediately think of an exchange for liquidity of an altcoin. And when you talk to an advertising person, you say exchange, they immediately think about the buying and selling of media. And so it's a funny word that has a lot of meanings, and I want to just clarify that for the audience, that if you were to think about how digital advertising works today, every impression that gets shown across the web or on mobile or on your TV or on a smart device of some kind is effectively undergoing a decision tree of real-time auctioning that happens in under 50 milliseconds. It's not known what ad is going to be shown to you until the very second you actually look at it, and all this data is looked at, and then that ad is decided based on that. And so if you think about it, digital advertising is like the world's largest exchange auction in existence, and it's largely centralized. I mean, when I say largely, I mean almost exclusively centralized. And going to your question about both security and what are the other objections that people have brought up, people have said, okay, last time I looked, Bitcoin is transacting at 3 to 5 transactions a second, and Ethereum maybe 10. Hashgraph is showing some really promising results, but how in the hell are you going to handle the million QPS, queries per second, that we need in this space? And so that was almost the first objection that people looked at, not even security, but how are you going to handle the volumes that are needed in the digital ad space to even make this a promising thing? And even insiders within ad tech, they understand ad tech in its current rendition. To reimagine it and to think about a fully decentralized ad serving infrastructure tier is a bit mind-boggling. When you get on the web and you look at a particular web page that has ads, the high likelihood is that that ad is being delivered at a Reston, Virginia, or at a somewhere in Santa Clara. Period. If you're in the United States, period, the end. What if you were able to overlay a mining philosophy where miners were ad serving providers in a hyper localized fashion, again on data center like infrastructure, but you had potentially thousands and thousands of quote unquote ad serving miners that existed geographically, so that when you look at an ad, that ad could actually be delivered in the data center down the street, not necessarily in the data center across the country with fat pipes. When you start to decentralize how that ad delivery occurs, and then on top of that, apply next generation consensus approaches, you start to achieve the volumes that are needed to address the digital ad space. And so that there is kind of problem number one, not so much security. Now, on your first question about security, that is a valid question, but I think it's the question is usually founded around people not knowing the interplay of crypto wallets with blockchain implementations. The questions have been like, well, if MTGOX can fail, what happens to you if you fail? You know, and when they say you, they mean exchange. And, you know, it's a totally different metaphor. They're kind of incorporating this as if it's a centralized wallet manager, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. What we've really designed here is something that is very decentralized in terms of every player in the ad space, you know, on exchange has its own crypto key, has its own crypto wallet, and fraud exists when there are opacity. When there is opacity, when there's transparency, fraud is very difficult to get away with. And when the identity of every entity is known by the crypto key, then it is very addressable. And so I would actually argue that applying blockchain technology architectures to digital ads will be a massive step up with regard to security than what currently exists. Like there are companies that are in this space called data enrichment within the digital ad space, where they have bought a bunch of data from a variety of different sources about individual consumers, and that data is keyed off of a cookie. That data about all these different consumers is done over an FTP, and there is zero traceability on whether or not after you give that data to some partner, whether or not they're now syndicating that data at scale. And now all of a sudden your consumer data about the fact that you're this 40-something that watches some very eclectic movies is no longer private to the company that collected that about you. It's now delivered at scale. When you can apply that to a ledger framework for the buying and the selling and also the data enrichment, there is a consumer safety element that is profound, that does not exist in this space today.
Well, that is pretty groundbreaking, I'd say.
We are really excited about it, and I think that, you know, we're doing a SAFT-based token sale here at the start of the new year. Not right at the start, but very close in. Kind of finalizing all of our docs, and you know, because we're not two folks, you know, two guys and gals in a garage with a white paper. We've got a company, and we're belt in suspenders on governance, and we're belt in suspenders on docs, and so it's taking a little longer than I guess some folks would be taking. But I think what's neat is that we're really looking at the full vision of tokenizing this ecosystem, this industry, which is a $230 billion annual industry. And there are few supply chains. If you think about the supply chain space that blockchain can support, think about how many of them have a product or service that is delivered entirely electronically. There aren't a lot. And in the advertising space, as soon as that ad is actually shown, that product has been delivered. And so from a friction perspective, advertising is one of the most fundamentally, profoundly positive opportunities around blockchain, because you can literally digitally demonstrate the delivery of the product as fast as it is served. And that feedback loop is now there. Whereas if you're doing a supply chain on the origination of food from farm to table, God be with you. That is a lot of infrastructure to attach to. If you are looking at freight movement through containers on ships, fantastic. But like you just think about all the pieces and parts in the physical space that have to make that happen. In advertising, it can entirely be dealt with digitally.
That's really good. So how do you normally get customers then? And does the blockchain give people more reassurance, or is that something which you talk about later on in the in that sales cycle?
Great question. It's a bit later on. I mean, it's kind of like saying, I really want to buy this car because the clutch system is so phenomenal.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I mean, if the thing is fast as hell, then that's what's interesting, right? Or whatever the USP is. Yeah. In terms of the value prop, the unique selling point is really around, can you identify money well spent versus money wasted? And how quickly can you identify it, and how quickly can you put that to work? We have a solution with Kochava today that does that very, very well. We are, no question, the Tesla in this market space of what we do around measurement. And what's interesting is that as we stand, despite that leadership position, we have been the ones who have been ushering in this blockchain concept so aggressively, because we believe it's kind of like saying, it's kind of like applying the same kind of category to, Microsoft spent a ton of time developing and R&Ding PDAs. And they thought of everything in the context of the operating system of Windows. And obviously they got their lunch eaten with the advent of the iPhone. And they got their, they along with a whole bunch of other people. And so it's an age-old example of thinking metaphorically about the business that you're in, which is the interesting thing. And, the business that we're in is that we are a system of record for our customer. And the blockchain is a system of record in a lot of areas. And so instead of saying, well, we're going to continue to be a measurement company, the acknowledgement from us early on was really that we're going to continue to be a system of record. And that's going to include measurement. It's going to include ratings around fraud. It's going to include discovery of new inventory vis-a-vis our protocols on this blockchain. And that the approach that we have to take has to be different than the approach that we've taken in the past, aka this whole system has to be open sourced. And as we build it, there may be closed source components which we built separately as an enterprise entity, but it has to use the same pipes and the same on-ramp and off-ramp of the open system that we're inviting everyone else to use. And so we can't have any kind of special on-ramp that we're taking. We just have to have the benefit of having thought about it as much as we have for as long as we have.
How many of your customers are actually using the blockchain service?
Good question. So the service is not publicly launched yet. It's now just being implemented within our partner community to get their inventory on the system. So they are not using it yet, but they weren't intending to use it. It's not a thing yet to have them be able to use it. And so part of doing this token sale is much around kind of getting incentives aligned across the ecosystem of participants to see the value of holding this token for the tokenization of this industry. It's also a mechanism to show the advertising ecosystem, including our customers, the opportunity to think about buying and selling media in this new way. So the whole system will be in production at the end of 2018. So we're literally for the next 2 quarters integrating our, you think about how we're transforming this decentralized ad serving tier. That takes getting all the supply integrated. The fact that we have over 10 supply partners already signed up to be on exchange illustrates that we're not splintering this industry. We're rather unifying them, and that gives confidence to our customers and other demand companies, other buyers of media, that this can be the thing that they can buy media from in a unified way on an open blockchain system.
Does the use of blockchain for your exchange product affect any advertising standards or legislation?
That is an awesome question. So we're on the founding group within IAB, that's the Internet Advertising Bureau. They're the ones that really started to come together with standards around ad units. And we're on the founding group of the Blockchain Tech Lab. We're actually making Exchange available as a program track within the IAB Tech Lab, so that the IAB can both certify and confirm kind of their perspective. It's what's interesting is I talked a lot about how Exchange is putting a smart contract to the insertion order. One of the really interesting things that the IAB did early on is that they standardized the legal agreement for an insertion order, so that when buyers and sellers of media want to unify on a contract, they're not dealing with these behemoth advertisers that say, oh, my terms have to apply, and then these big publishers that say, oh, my terms have to apply. The IAB literally standardized the contract terms for an insertion order. And so what we think is so interesting is this can, and they're now at version 3, by the way. So they're at version 3 of the IAB standard terms of insertion order for buying and selling media. And what we're talking to the IAB at, and what we're working with that whole group within the Tech Lab, is Exchange really represents the opportunity to be version 4, which is a smart contract implementation of the IAB standard terms, which is a really neat and profound application of kind of standards. Now, regulation, that is going to be a very interesting thing that is going to unpack over the next 24 months easily. So GDPR is probably the closest regulatory thing that's happening on the forefront, which is, by end of May, 2 basic rights have to be made available to citizens of countries in Europe. One is they have to know what you're tracking about them, and they have to have the right to be forgotten. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff related to that, but those are the 2 fundamental rights that citizens of those countries have to be afforded. Or you can't be a technology provider; you kind of run the risk of having a fine for not abiding by those rules. Now, as a technology company, we're going to be providing that anyways, with or without Exchange, with or without a blockchain implementation. But if you think about the right to be forgotten, and you overlay that with an immutable ledger, you've got a very interesting problem on your hands. You may not want to be targeted, but the very fact that you don't want to be targeted means that there has to be an entry for you as an individual in some addressable fashion. Now, in Exchange, there's this really interesting interplay of addressability of audiences, either by a cookie ID or a mobile ad ID. And we've done some really interesting innovation around the technology to make that possible, as well as interlink with other blockchains around identity. But I think what we're going to see with GDPR and other regulations is that, much like the Digital Copyright Act being legislated without a clear understanding of how technology works, we're going to see some, and we've already seen it from Europe as a whole. I mean, you've got legislation being created for the European Union that doesn't have a lot of consistency from a technical implementation perspective. Up until this point, this is fascinating. The EU recognizes an IP address as PII, personal identifiable information. But they do not, however, recognize an IDFA, a mobile ad ID, as personal identifiable information. Now, there's a lot of schools of thought that think that that's kind of changed, but from a legislation perspective, an IP address that is a ID that is roaming based on where you connect, that's considered PII, but an advertising ID, which actually doesn't change unless you physically change it and actually is targeted directly to your phone, is not. That's a classic example where regulation is trying to get very specific in ways that are not applicable, and they're completely absent of specificity when it is. And so we're going to we are going to see as an industry, whether it's advertising or anything else. I mean, there's this notion of a CDP, a customer data platform. Think of it like a CRM for digitally connected devices. Large companies have CDPs that are kind of the CRM of their customer base that engage with their phones and with TVs, Apple TV and smart TVs. You think about, how a smart refrigerator that has an Android operating system rendezvous for an audience with the smartphone that's also on the same household. That's the kind of stuff we measure today. We unify those audiences today. And regulation is nowhere close to understanding the implications of all this stuff. And you have to be working with companies you trust and you believe are stewards of your data. This is why we're so focused on your data as your data for our customer base. But boy, as an industry, we have seen regulation always 10 years behind what happens in technology. And either, there's going to be a lot of interesting consequences post May 28. Something is going to happen. You're either going to have an all-out blackout of available information on the internet for European countries, and it's going to go back to the dark ages because people are going to say, okay, well, Brussels wants to have this rule. You don't have access to this content. Or you're going to see a variable, implementation of regulation with a few categorical fines for a few big companies that have the money to pay it. Or you're going to see a very centralized approach to managing GDPR permissions, which by its very nature is against the spirit of the regulation of GDPR in the first place. And no bureaucrat is going to stand up and support, I'm getting a little bit on a soapbox, but this is a tough one that I think as a population, as a culture, we're going to have to reconcile.
Yeah, and I'm sure Brussels will do a very good job at that. I actually lived there for a year. It's a very, very crazy place, and I'm surprised anything gets done. But
it's amazing.
Let's see what happens in that space. I'm sure that's another one to watch out for, and no doubt blockchain will either be at $500 or $100,000 at that point as well.
Right.
Just to add some more interest into life, the universe, and everything.
Dude, you're totally right. And I mean, I don't know if you've been kind of tracking this kind of hoopla about transaction fees to get consensus on transferring large volumes of Bitcoin with the increase of the price or, the relative price of gas as all these people are trying to build projects around Ethereum and the way the consensus, all of this comes down to how this consensus modeling works. I think it's the hidden gem of what's going to make blockchain platforms work versus not work over the long term. But people aren't going to realize it until a little bit later, and you roll the tape fast forward. There's some really interesting implications.
Oh, absolutely. And it's going to change the way we do everything.
Yeah.
And as long as it can remain secure, I think the only thing against the whole blockchain is public's perception. And I've said this before in podcasts that a few months ago, you mentioned Bitcoin, and that's for drug dealers and people buying guns. And now suddenly the people on the street go, I need to invest in that. How do I do it? And I'm like, use Coinbase, but don't try and get your money out if it starts dropping quickly because far too many transactions and it goes down. But I'm sure Coinbase are trying to improve that. It does seem to be the way at the moment.
Yeah.
But with any investment, you stick in it for long enough, and either your money will go back to where it was, or you could make an absolute fortune. But I think everybody's made their fortunes now, and it's just going to bumble along, shall we say?
Yeah.
But there we go. That's not what you're here for. You're here for using the blockchain for good and advertising purposes. And I know we have people on the podcast who are very interested in this space. So how do they get in touch with you? How do they find out more?
Yep, you bet. So exchange.io, XCHNG.io. You can get a hold of our white paper. You can contact us if you're an accredited investor. and are interested in participating in our SAFT, again, we're very belt and suspenders. We would love to put you on the list. We're going to start making prepared KYC whitelist systems available to the people who have expressed interest thus far in the very near future. And we have a bit more information on XCHNG.io. There's a video that kind of summarizes the vision behind what we've done and why we've done it. And there's some resources about partners that have already come on board, like the on-exchange partners that I talked about. We've got an announcement of a handful of advisors who are very well-respected, well-known ad tech folks, as you can imagine, Kochava being the leader that we are in the space that we are, very well connected, and so getting others involved in that context is relatively straightforward. So we want to just talk about that a little bit. I think in as much as what we're doing is exciting for the blockchain industry, space from a technical perspective, I think what's also really interesting, and I think it's a wave of the future, is that what we're doing in that we're an existing company who is applying blockchain in a way that's more than just an idea, that's actually got a first use case technology example. We're getting it integrated with our technology partners. That is very unique. And the focus that we have around governance, around our approach, in the same way that I think you highlighted that the public perception of security around blockchain is a risk. I think equally the public perception of absence of governance for tokenized projects is a huge risk. It's not a risk for us, but I think it's an optics risk for people that want to participate.
Absolutely fantastic. Okay, so people, if you are listening, you've got this far, you might as well click on the link and find out more. So what's your calendar look like this year? So you say about May, the interesting stuff coming out of Brussels. What are key dates which our listeners need to look out for in regards to your company this year?
Yeah, so first quarter is going to be pretty exciting. We're going to start our pre-sale process. We've got a bunch of commitments already made from a soft circle perspective. You're going to hear about advisors that are going to be involved, more on-exchange partners, so supply partners and demand partners who are integrating our tech. I think the other really interesting thing is you're going to start seeing some benchmark numbers coming from us. So we're going to be benchmarking our consensus engine to help illustrate to the ecosystem of high-volume advertising ad tech folks that we can absolutely crush it in terms of volumes in the system. I suspect, based on what I've heard so far, that there's 2 or 3 other blockchain projects that are interested in actually using our consensus engine on exchange. And so they're trying to line up their own token sale along with our availability of our consensus engine, because it'll meet their needs better than Ethereum with an ERC20. And so I think that's a really interesting development that we've been hearing about inbound that we're going to be talking about externally.
Charles, you are a real advertising wizard. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for the time. I had an opportunity to hear some of the podcasts, and I just so enjoyed it. And I think it's an honor and a privilege to be able to share our story in the same way that others have. It's a neat setup.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks again. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been very enlightening, and I love the fact that this is a different use for blockchain, but the whole purpose of this is that blockchain has opened our eyes and our listeners' eyes to something different, as well as the basis being the blockchain. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. We wish you luck, and hopefully we get in touch with you in the middle of 2018 and see how things are going.
Awesome. Thanks, gents.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Are you looking for an easy way to buy Bitcoin or Ether on a safe, secure platform? Coinbase is the easiest place to buy and sell digital currencies. Sign up today as a friend of the Blockchain Show, and if you buy or sell $100 of Bitcoin or more, you'll earn $10 of free Bitcoin for yourself and $10 of Bitcoin to support this show. Join now using the link in this episode's show notes at theblockchainshow.com. To learn more, visit theblockchainshow.com.